Thank you very much to Alex TLC for the kind invite again for giving this update, and we have additional data at last which really helps to take us forward. So my name is Arun Mistry. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Minoryx. I'm a pediatrician by training and worked in the NHS but then moved into the industry. So Minoryx is a small Spanish company. I'm based in the UK. We have one product called leriglitazone, which we're developing for several diseases, and adrenoleukodystrophy is our key focus. We have actually submitted a marketing authorization with the European Medicines Agency for use of leriglitazone in adrenoleukodystrophy. So that is being evaluated at the moment. If that is successful, again, it takes time, the regulators take time. If that's successful, then the MHRA in the UK will also have a look at the data, and there's a potential approval in the UK towards the end of 2026. So it takes time, unfortunately. Clinical trials take time, but we're on the right pathway. The product is an oral suspension, so it's not an injection or a gene therapy. It's just a solution in a bottle that's taken with a syringe by mouth. We also have other diseases that we could possibly treat that we're investigating as well, and we have something called Rett syndrome, another rare neurological disease, typically in girls, young girls, that we're investigating as well at the moment. So what is leriglitazone? It's a molecule that is called a PPAR gamma agonist. So I won't go into the details of that, but what does it do? The key area that it works for, especially the leukodystrophies, is on the neuroinflammation pathways. So if you think about adrenoleukodystrophy, and some of the explanations that were coming from Dr. Green, you get the demyelination, but also you get aggressive growth of lesions as well, which are often promoted by inflammation, which really sort of viciously cycles up the growth of the lesions and breakdown of what's called the blood-brain barrier. And the pathway that leriglitazone works on is really important for the anti-inflammatory effects. So we really reduce down the inflammation. But also the product works on myelination. It reduces demyelination. As you heard from Dr. Green, there are different types of effects of the diseases on the myelin. And in adrenoleukodystrophy, you get demyelination. So we actually avoid some of that demyelination. Also, we've got some evidence to say that we support remyelination as well, which actually, again, protects the pathways. And then there's another effect. Mitochondria are part of cells that support the energy development of the cells. And often in these neurological diseases, leukodystrophies and other CNS, central nervous system diseases, the energy levels in the cells in the brains is downgraded. And this is something, again, that the product can do, is to boost up that energy to keep that cell working better. So they're the sorts of activities, and all of these different activities from our sense contribute to what we call neuroprotection, so helping the brain cells survive longer and also avoid impacts of the disease. So as I've said, we're going to focus on adrenoleukodystrophy and specifically on cerebral, the cerebral form of the leukodystrophy. I won't take you into all of the details of what is adrenoleukodystrophy. I think you're all experts here in the room. But really, it's a genetic disorder where there's a gene defect of what is called the ABCD1 gene, carried on the X chromosome, and it results in an increase in the very long-chain fatty acids, which causes problems in the central nervous system, in the myelin, and some of the pathways. Also affects the adrenal glands and the testes. There is now newborn screening in the US. We know this is an ongoing active discussion, of course, in the UK. We're hoping bringing products forwards will help that dialogue with the government. Our focus is the cerebral form of the disease, where you have lesions in the brain, which can progress very quickly and without treatment can lead to neurological decline and death within 3 to 4 years. We won't forget that there are other forms of the disease from the same genetic mutation. So in adults, all men will get adrenomyeloneuropathy, AMN, and also women have the problem if they have the genetic disorder. They have problems with mobility, becoming wheelchair bound, often a little bit later in life, but still, of course, impacted significantly. But our focus at the moment is looking at the cerebral form of the disease with our current application. These two phenotypes, different physical characteristics of the disease, develop independently, and adults can also get the cerebral form of the disease as well as children, as well as boys. So focusing on the men, because of the cerebral form of the disease, from all of the natural history and publications, 2/3 of men and boys will develop the progressive form of the disease and be affected. 1/3 of them during childhood, between the ages of 2 to 12, less so in adolescence, and then a further third during adulthood. And that can happen at any time during the adult lifetime. There is a treatment which is really good in terms of bone marrow transplant. However, there's a finite window for that, and the disease has to be identified early and managed very quickly with the transplant procedures. Transplant is risky, causes morbidity in terms of complications, can cause death as well because of complications of the transplant, infections, etc. It's sometimes not widely available, and there's always a delay sometimes in donor identification. And then adults, in men, there is poorer survival, less experience. The good news is that in the UK, that is now available, wasn't available previously. So at least things are moving forward. So I think that's important. There is a gene therapy, but that is only available in the US. So there's no gene therapy available in Europe. And really, there are no treatments to avoid the progressive disease. So the only treatments available are to treat the progressive disease. So just a simple schematic to explain how cerebral ALD evolves in terms of the lesions. And you saw lots of MRIs. There's a few MRIs that come through here. I'll just click through there. So as Dr. Green was saying, you're looking for lesions in the brain with MRI scans. First of all, you can have no lesions, and for adrenoleukodystrophy, there's a special scoring system called the LESS score. Typically, you'd see no lesions, but when you look at additional scans, additional modalities of the MRI scan, there are already potentially some white matter disturbances, but without actual lesions being seen. Lesions then develop with a gadolinium negative lesion. So gadolinium negative means that the blood-brain barrier is not disrupted. So this is a barrier, a blockage between the brain and the blood system to avoid the transmission of infections, toxins, etc. But if that is broken, then cells, infections, etc., toxins can get across the blood-brain barrier. And gadolinium is a way of assessing that, the integrity of the barrier. So gadolinium negative lesions can start occurring. You see this lesion down here. And then if that blood-brain barrier breaks down, the lesion becomes gadolinium positive. The lesions are growing, so the less score is growing. And once these lesions become positive, they grow very rapidly and lead to future neurological problems. So you see these lesions on the scans first. You see sometimes blood changes in what's called the neurofilament light chain levels, which are a signifier of myelin breakdown. But these biomarkers, as they're called, the MRI changes and the blood changes, come before any of the clinical symptoms. So it's really important to find these things early by routine and regular MRI scanning for both boys and men. So I'm going to take you through 3 sets of data. First of all, really focusing on Nexus, which is a pediatric study, which is now completed. There's a study in boys aged 2 to 12. We have 23 patients, and the study has met what's called the primary endpoint. So the question that we asked, the study has answered, and we've actually been successful. I'll also talk to you about the advanced study very briefly. This is a study you may have heard about for several years if you've been coming to this meeting. This was a study in adult men with ALD, but looking at their AMN symptoms, their adrenomyeloneuropathy symptoms. It was a large study with 116 patients. The primary endpoint was a 6-minute walk test, but we weren't successful on that. So again, the question we were asking, we weren't successful on the spinal cord part of the problem. But we did see something important, which I'll explain to you on the cerebral side of the disease. And then, very briefly, there's a publication from some compassionate use of leriglitazone in France that I will take you through as well, very briefly. So Nexus, this was the pediatric study. This was a study which was, as I've said, in boys aged 2 to 12, with both gadolinium negative and gadolinium positive lesions. The LESS score was less than or equal to 10, so early disease, as is defined in the guidelines. And the boys were all neurologically well, so they did not have neurological problems, and this is the NFS, the neurological functional score, so they're either less than or equal to 1. So this is a score of up to 25, so these boys were neurologically well, in a sense very asymptomatic. And we have 23 patients coming into the study. We have 20 what we term as evaluable, that we can measure the changes between the different time points. The study was an open label study, so all patients, all 23 patients came into the study and received treatment. The primary endpoint, so the key question we were asking, was the percentage of patients with clinical and radiological disease arrest. In a sense, are we stopping the disease both clinically in terms of symptoms and also on the MRI scan of slowing down or stopping progression of the disease? We did look at other questions about the LESS score, specifically about the clinical, the NFS, the gadolinium intensity. So we were looking at that. Also, we looked at the lesion volume, which is something new, but important in terms of looking at something much more objective, that's measurable. So we were looking at that as well. So just going back to this schematic, we have, as you've seen, the gadolinium negative, gadolinium positive patients. We had 9 gadolinium negative patients and 14 gadolinium positive patients. And there is some publications, natural history, that says in multiple papers that when a lesion starts, be it gadolinium negative or gadolinium positive in boys in this age group of 2 to 12, less than or around 10% will self-arrest. So the disease stops. Nobody knows why, but if you don't do anything, 1 out of 10 patients, the disease does not progress. So that's what's written down in multiple publications. What we saw with Nexus was that we had 35% disease arrest. Important here to say, and should have said it on the previous slide, is that the study was designed as a treatment prior to transplant. So some of these patients, if they were progressing, could go to transplant, and that's why not all patients went all the way through to 96 weeks. But it's something that is, the treatment is to complement transplant. It's not to replace, but it's how we have to sort of step by step integrate different ideas and different treatments. And this is how the study was planned. But this is the key thing. The study was successful, that 7 out of the 20 patients who came into the study and were evaluable, where we could measure changes from the baseline, had a disease arrest. So that was the study being successful. Looking at the lesion volume, and we have some data from natural history again, where this is what we call a log scale, because the lesions grow very rapidly. From a small lesion, it can grow very rapidly. So this is, going back to your maths days, a log scale. And this is the natural history of how quickly the lesions can grow in volume. With leriglitazone, this is what we have, is that this lesion growth is slowed down significantly, and there is a separation between the two groups as we measure them. So we actually get what is called a significant result when we compare the two groups. So again, we're seeing that the lesions are slowing down in growth and significantly slowing down compared to natural history. When we look at the LES score, and this is the gadolinium negative patients, you can see that the LES score stays fairly low down. There are a few patients who escape and did proceed to transplant. So there's 3 patients here that proceeded to transplant, but 6 patients remained very low on the LES score and really were stable on their MRIs. The patients who were gadolinium positive, when they came into the study, there was lesion stabilization seen, in terms of a few patients did proceed to have very rapid increases in the LES score, but many of the patients had a sort of gradual but plateauing effect. So again, we're slowing down the disease from that treatment. Most of these patients, all of these patients, in the end did end up having a transplant, but at least it gives a treatment you can give before the transplant happens. And that's another way of thinking, how can this product be complementing current treatment? And then clinically, this neurological functional score, whilst all patients were on treatment, and we now have several patients approaching 2 to 3 years of treatment, all of the patients have remained neurologically stable. So not having symptoms, not having any clinical problems of worsening whilst on treatment. So again, really sort of reassuring there. Quickly onto the advanced study, and this was the study in adult men. The key finding that we saw in a 2-year double-blind period, which is looking at the product, leriglitazone, against placebo, so a dummy version of the product without the actual active ingredient. And the study was designed as a randomized study with what we call a 2-to-1 randomization, so more patients on leriglitazone, 77, compared to 39 on placebo. But what we saw over 2 years was that only patients on placebo developed the progressive form of the disease of cerebral adrenal leukodystrophy, whereas no patients over 2 years on leriglitazone developed the disease. So it's a good signal that we started seeing in the adult study. And then just thinking about this additional data that we have, which has been published from compassionate use in Paris. This is again just in adults, men aged 19 to 67. There were 13 patients who were treated and then studied sort of over a 2-year period, up to a 2-year period. What the doctors in Paris saw was that 77% of the patients, so 10 out of the 13, were clinically and radiologically stable for up to 2 years. 4 out of the 10 actually had some levels of improvement in cognition and some motor abilities. 5 of the patients from the 13 actually came into the program needing a transplant, and over that 2-year period they came off that transplant list. Some have gone on to transplants in the future, but again, it's a complementary treatment. It's not to treat instead of a transplant, potentially to avoid or prolong the time that transplant needs to be managed. So again, very reassuring in how the product is working in a real world setting. So this is not a formal clinical trial, but they collected data and it's been published. And then importantly, safety, because all drugs have issues, and important that we talk about those. We've got, through all of the clinical development programs, we've got quite a lot of data now for a rare disease, but also the product comes from a family of drugs which are used in diabetes for many, many years, and we know the types of problems and issues that can occur. The 2 key things are fluid retention. So adults get edema, which is puffiness of their ankles and sometimes of their face. Children get typically puffiness around their eyes and their face. So it's fluid retention because of an effect on the kidneys that reduces fluid reabsorption back into the system. But that is not causing any concerns. It's something that we're expecting. And also weight gain. So weight gain happens because of fluid retention and also from an increase in the fat tissue. So something that PPAR gamma agonists do is increase the development of fat tissue. But we have significant data in adults and pediatrics in terms of number of patient years. So we don't feel that there's any safety concerns so far that we've seen. Of course, we keep monitoring that long term. And then finally, I'd just like to finish with a study that we actually have ongoing in the UK at Queen Square with Dr. Lackman. This is called the Calyx study. This is a study in adult men with gadolinium-positive cerebral lesions. And this is a study which really sort of helps complement the Nexus study in cerebral ALD, in that we're looking at patients who've got active disease, so the gadolinium-positive disease. We're looking for 40 men in total who are not recommended for transplant. So if transplant's available, of course that's the route that the men should take and be recommended for. But not all men can go towards transplant because of other issues that the transplant doctors, the neurologists will see in terms of their capabilities to withstand the transplant procedures. We've got the study open in America, Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Spain, France, India, and the UK. As we saw with the Nexus study, there's a lot of publications to say that you get a 10% disease arrest without any treatment. The adult form of the disease does not have that detailed clearly in the literature, and because of that reason we've had to do this study as a placebo-controlled study. So 20 men will receive the active treatment and 20 men will receive the placebo. The primary objective, the key question we're asking, is what is the survival between the 2 different groups? So that it is patients who are not eligible for transplant, so in a sense don't have any other options except possibly going into this study. So we're looking at something which is much more like a cancer study, but because there's not enough published or enough data to know what happens to these men when this type of disease happens, we've had to do it as a placebo-controlled study. The study design looks complex, but simply the patients are randomized, split into the 2 groups, and followed for 18 months. After 18 months of the last patient, patient number 40, having had the treatment for 18 months, we're allowed to do an analysis. If that's successful, All patients then transfer to what's called the open label, and all patients receive active drug. If not successful, then it goes to another analysis at 27 months. If that's successful, again, everybody jumps to open label. If not successful, the study goes on to the end, which is 36 months. The key inclusion criteria, and this is the critical slide for this study, is we're looking for men who are over 18, who have what would be seen as early cerebral disease, a LES score of greater than 0.5 and less than 12. They have to have gadolinium enhancing, so gadolinium positive disease, and be clinically well. We know men can be wheelchair bound, have incontinence problems, but that's something that is from their AMN background, so that is allowed into the study. And again, as I've said earlier, we're looking for men who are not recommended to undergo transplant. So I'll stop there, but if there's any questions, happy to take them. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Arun, and sorry to, it's just everyone's going to want their coffee in a minute. It's really interesting, and I know some men who are on the trial and some children who are using compassionate use, and it really does seem to be changing the sort of outlook. So we've just got to keep our fingers crossed.